With the 25th anniversary of 9/11 approaching, I decided to go back and watch all of the wall-to-wall news coverage of the day as it happened on the 11th, 12th, and 13th in 2001 on ABC.
I watched it by proxy, but why?
Well, the truth is that at least once per year since the coverage, and sometimes more often, since the coverage became available for replay on YouTube somewhere in the early 2000s, I rewatched the coverage of, one of the most historical events of my lifetime. And probably the reason is that I want to be reminded of all that happened that day and the following days so that I never forget how I felt. But more importantly, I'm combing this coverage, or I feel compelled to, for the reminders of the social and political statements and discussions and sentiments that may have faded from my memory over time. These are the things that are often written out of the official record of summarized history and AI-generated blurbs that tend to appear at our fingertips after a quick Google search or a ChatGPT inquiry, right? So inevitably each year, and again, sometimes more often, I notice something newly significant to me as I try to make sense of these events. And sometimes what I notice is some detail that I realize that I forgot. But the takeaways I appreciate the most are the epiphanies that come as the result of seeing aspects of the event through the lens of my own maturation in the meantime and life experiences throughout the years. Because, when 9/11 happened, I was in my 20s, and now I'm a lot older.
The fact of the matter is that facts matter. And the facts about the order of events, official statements, and the earliest impressions on that day and the days immediately after are found in the news archives.
Yeah. And if you want to know for yourself, there really is no shortcut to understanding or remembering what happened that day. So let's talk about the as it happened news coverage of that day.
I'm Heit.
And I'm Cheri.
And you've discovered Axiom Amnesia.
We want to thank all of the supporters who helped to make this video possible. If you want your name to appear alongside these contributors, make a one-time donation via Cash App, or you can head on over to patreon.com/axiomamnesia to enjoy all of the benefits of becoming a monthly subscriber. Just to give you guys some perspective, we were actually both adults when 9/11 occurred. I know just from some of your comments in the past, some of you guys are, in your 20s, some in your 30s, some in your 40s and 50s and beyond. And so depending on, how old you are now, 9/11 might be a very different thing, and depending on if you were an adult and you actually went through it, if you were a child, or maybe even if you weren't born yet. And this matters, the fact that we were both adults, because our memories of that day are not through the lens of somebody who was too young to fully comprehend the significance of the events, or perhaps wasn't even born in 2001. So let's talk first a little bit about, where were you that day?
Wow. I was asleep. So I was in college.
We were both asleep. We didn't know each other back then, but we were both asleep.
Was this before or after Aaliyah?
This was after Aaliyah.
Yeah. So this was like big news things, right? But I was asleep. So the thing was, Rock the Boat used to be on the radio and stuff. And I haven't been a TV watcher for many decades by now.
By the way, died at age 22 on August 25th, 2001.
Yeah, so it was close in time, right? So that was one of the songs that was always playing on the radio. I didn't have a TV. I had a TV, but I never watched it. I had a VCR, and I used to watch Pootie Tang all the time. I think it was Pootie Tang. But I had a radio, and I had an early class. I had an early class like 7:30 in the morning, and I didn't live on campus. I lived across the street. And that's how I wake up. Sometimes I just had the radio playing, right, while I'm asleep. And then I woke up and they talking about, I think it was after
both
planes hit. And I'm like, what are they talking about? Because I missed my first class. I just didn't go.
So then you wake up and
I hear this on the radio, and the local people are worried about what might happen locally.
What was in Baton Rouge?
Yeah, because it's refineries. If you're going to attack somebody, you will, like we see now in Iran, one of the things is their fuel supply. And
so did you wake up in time before the buildings were down, or
No,
everything had happened?
It was probably my alarm clock went off and then I turned it off, but everything had already happened.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah, and then it was like, oh, school shut down, no classes today or whatever.
Yeah. Wow. Well, for me, I was at one of my first real jobs of my life. And well, let me take that back. I wasn't at it. This was a time in my life where I was working. I too was asleep, and I received a call. At that point, I worked Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and this happened on a Tuesday. So I was off that day, and I sleep late when I'm off, right? And my mother called, and she herself was at work, and she said, turn on the TV and look. And she was trying to tell me what was happening, but she couldn't talk that much. She was at work, and her primary concern besides that was something's going on. What's going on? So she showed me, and then I watched, and within a minutes of her telling me to look, it was only the first plane at that point. And within maybe 5 or 6 minutes of watching, because I got off the phone with her, then that's when the second plane. And it was like, whoa. At that point, I still, even 25 years later, remember the sinking feeling in my heart that like, oh my gosh, because at that point, I think everybody knew what it was. And if you didn't know what it was when you saw it, you knew what it was when they told you on the news, like, hey, this was deliberate. And so, and it was just a very scary and helpless feeling that I felt. But what made it more complicated was as soon as that happened, my mom called me back and she's like, oh my gosh, get to your sister, call her, get her on the phone, because my sister, we lived in Chicago at the time, worked in the Sears Tower. And that's what they called it back then.
Was it the tallest in the world then?
I think it was still the tallest in the world at that point. And, she was like, tell her, to get out of there. And so I finally reached my sister, and it didn't take long. I say finally, she answered pretty quickly. And she said, yeah, they're having us to evacuate, but they say maybe we don't really have to. It was optional, I think she told me at that time. And then I was just like, man, just get out of there. Just tell them you're going home. Just tell them you're going home. And she was like, okay. Cause I'm like, if you get out now, then you could take the elevator, boom, you down, and look. And this was, again, this was her actual first job straight out of college. So, she was just like, man, I can't be leaving. You know how it is on your job. I can't just be up and leaving the job. But I was like, man, get out that building. I had been given the marching orders. I'm the older sister. Like, just get on out of there. Call me when you out. So she called later. And this was before the buildings came down. And yeah, so that was my experience. And pretty much for the rest of the day, I'm just glued in front of the television like most other people in America were, if you weren't in New York or Washington, D.C. or someplace they were evacuating. And
I went over to the campus, and then, because I spent all my time over there anyway, but I went over to the campus.
Did you feel like you needed to just be around people, like you wanted to see what was going on?
No, but that's just what I'd done every day
anyway.
So,
yeah. And you were going to go there anyway once you got up and, went to whatever your class later was.
Yeah, even if I wasn't going to class.
Yeah, you were the quad guy.
Yeah.
Hanging out in the
People
quad
probably
at LSU.
know from around that time, I had a big afro and a camouflage jacket. That was me.
Was it bigger than in your picture here?
No.
It's probably like the same. I think it looked about the
same.
same from the pictures I've seen.
Yeah.
As many of you know, changes on this platform have pushed us toward a more viewer-funded model. So if you'd like to help to keep the channel going, there are a few easy ways to support us. You can become a member and unlock over 100 exclusive videos, plus additional member perks. You can also become an executive producer or co-executive producer on an upcoming video through our Deep Dive on Demand, starting at just $10, which gets your name on the screen and a shout out during the video, or you can pick up some merch to represent the community. And don't forget to join our mailing list so you never miss a video across any of our channels. Also, if you're looking for something to watch after this video, be sure to check out our bedtime binge playlist that's linked below. It's full of videos you may have missed. You'll find links to all of these options in the description. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for being here. And thanks for helping keep these deep dives coming. But at any rate, so those were our personal experiences. But I do feel very compelled, like I said, to go back and watch. And you guys know I'm watching this like after Heit falls asleep or something, or, in these odd hours. And I know, like, sometimes if I fall asleep with on Height's waking up and he's watching like coverage of the towers. And
Yeah. So there used to be a website. So the thing is, we have YouTube. YouTube then took down a whole bunch of stuff over the years. It was a
especially
good
related
place.
to this. Oh my.
Yes, it was a good place that had good archives. So you had things like documentaries like Zeitgeist, Loose Change, right? Where before, I guess they kind of got bought and stuff, and got funding and stuff. And he put out different versions of Loose Change, right? So all this original stuff used to be
The
on
addendum,
YouTube back
Loose
in the day.
Change, the Requiem.
Yeah.
It was a bunch of loose changes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you had all that, and then you had people putting up their footage. You had everybody with their different theories and stuff that we can't go back and see firsthand because YouTube started taking everything down.
Oh my gosh.
So-
and it's crazy. Yeah.
So there used to be a website, it's probably still around, where you could go and they categorized it by date and time and network, and you could just click through like you're just watching TV.
And I don't know, I think that website probably still is around, hopefully. But once
But the
everything
videos were on YouTube though too.
Oh, were they? Okay, because once
Yeah.
everything was on YouTube, then I just, but I look now and I'm like, yeah, people have scavenged off of YouTube, because so a lot of the videos I watched this past were just in the last 4 to 7 years old, and it's like, yeah, you just scrape that off of somebody, and now you just trying to well, I say you're trying to monetize it, but I didn't see any ads run during the video, so I don't know.
They just
But anyway,
re-uploaded
they
them,
just
yeah.
re-uploaded, and so the quality varies. But one of the things I'll say is I have seen every bit of the footage from at least ABC, NBC, CBS, CNBC,
yeah.
CNN. At the time, I don't think if there was, did I ever watch
MSNBC?
MSNBC? I think I mainly only watched CNBC.
NBC News
Then I
and
watched
stuff.
PBS. I've seen that. But the one that is, if this sounds kind of crazy, but the one,
C-SPAN?
I've seen C-SPAN as well. The one that is my favorite, though, and I say favorite in air quotes, but is ABC, because Peter Jennings' coverage was just by far superior. Now, what I will say is when it happened during the morning shows on Tuesday. So like Good Morning America, the Today Show. And so, on NBC, you have the Today Show with, at the time, Matt and Katie
Yeah.
were on there. And then you had Diane Sawyer on ABC for Good Morning America with, I can't think of the guy's name right off the top of my head. Go to the comments. What's his name that used to be on there with Diane Sawyer? But at any rate, so what happened is when it got real, then that's when they called in their evening anchor, which would be for ABC, Peter Jennings, and it was Tom Brokaw for NBC. Now, the coverage that you got right when it was happening, to me, was better on NBC. Like when I say when it was happening, I mean up to the second plane. And then from that point on, you want to switch to ABC, because on NBC, once Tom Brokaw came, he is just like bully brazen and whatever. And it clearly was a boys club. And if we know what happened to Matt Lauer after that, you know that there definitely was a boys club there. And so as Katie is trying to say things, it's clear that there is a power struggle and maybe even a little resentment from the people who like, this is my time and you brought the anchor, and so they're all
it's
three.
that, but also the early morning people aren't considered that serious in journalism, right? You have this life. Oh, I'm going to show you how to bake some cookies.
At the
you
time,
know what I'm saying?
right? At the time, because many of them have gone on to, later have that evening anchor desk.
Right.
But at the time, those were the big people.
Right, but it's just like still that same format is there. The early morning stuff, you're not doing the serious things, and then when you get towards the evening news and stuff like that, then you get the more serious journalism, right? So then the people attached to those roles are basically given those qualities.
Yeah.
So then when they have to bring them in, bring in the serious journalism. Boom, boom, boom.
Yes. But, Tom Brokaw is very abrasive to me in that respect. Not that he's not likable, but Peter Jennings was so gentle. And he came in with a grace that I tell you, Peter Jennings died a few years later, of, I think, a type of cancer. And he pretty much went off the air pretty quickly. He announced his diagnosis and then he left. But his coverage, I don't know if he won any awards, but he should have if he didn't.
So who was on CBS at
was
the time?
amazing. CBS was, dang, what was his name?
Dan Rather.
Dan Rather. Yes, CBS, it was Dan Rather, right? And so Dan Rather was a different type of journalist as well. I kind of like Dan Rather a little bit better, perhaps than Tom Brokaw. But yeah. So at any rate, I've seen all of this coverage. And what you realize up front and early on is just the shock that people had, the shock that we had just in our own lives, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this. And then just imagine if you're on the air when it happens.
Bruh.
We actually were live on YouTube on Heit's other channel when Nipsey Hussle.
Oh, Nipsey Hussle died.
What happened to him. And I told you during the broadcast that it happened, and you were like, hey, we're hearing reports and whatever. But that wasn't nearly, obviously, as big event as this. But it's like you don't have time to process what's going on,
exactly.
And you're getting the raw emotions of the people at the time, and it was just crazy.
Somebody who was locked up, they were in jail at the time, and they tell a story where, I don't know, in Texas, they have you working out in the field and stuff. And they were 4 out. And then they just drove up to him coming off fast. Get in here. The country's under attack. And you'd be like, what in the world?
Yeah. I mean, and I remember feeling that same, like I was so afraid. And then let me tell you why. I'm a Gen Xer. And in my lifetime, nothing had ever happened that made me think that in America that something like that could happen. And I know that was very naive up to that point, but it just was how it was. Previous generations, they had big wars. All we had was how long was the first Gulf War in the 91 or 90,
30 days.
But and nothing really happened from our end, right? In the United States. And so there was no reason to feel like, hey, this is around the corner.
And the only thing we really had, so the first thing you think about is the World Trade Center 93, right? Mm-hmm. You had that. You had Oklahoma City, and you had the 1996 Olympics.
Right.
So those were, it was just kind of like, not to call them small, because Oklahoma City was kind of big. But you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It was just like, that's the most that could happen. Somebody just do something, domestically,
right,
but then to consider that it could be possibly outside.
Yeah, the call was coming from within the house on that, Yeah. And then you always had, especially in the 90s, this whole, militia thing and, all the stuff, the Ruby Ridge, all of the stuff that happened.
The media was still talking about Russia. Mm-hmm. Everything, all the movies and all of that, it was just Russia and whoever else was, you know what I'm saying? And maybe some Eastern Europe actors, right? Would be the subject of all the movies and stuff. So that's what's really you're thinking about, because it's very strong with, how the media portrays things. So then after this, then you get all the, the Islamist sort of movies and media that would,
in
just
the media
dominate
for sure. But in the
movies.
Real world news, there were things that happened, like the USS Cole had happened before that. And, so UBL, and whose initials that, UBL was very much on the radar. In fact, I was going to go over some of the stuff that I thought about or, just was reminded of during this watch. And one of them was how quickly they brought up UBL's name. Like, I looked at it within an hour of the second plane. They were, quote unquote, sources from within the Pentagon. Sources were saying his name. Now, it might be that who your enemies are and whatever, but whatever. Bottom line is just a reminder of how quickly they his name was brought into the fold, and how quickly they started talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. And ultimately, those were the two fronts that they would, move on, right? So the next thing is Bush, President George W. Bush. His unpopularity at the time that this event happened cannot be understated, especially with Democrats, because what you have to remember is this was in September, mid-September. He only took office in January. And in November of the previous year, November of 2000, is when the election happened with Al Gore and the election that had to go all the way to the Supreme Court and came down to the state of Florida, who George Bush's brother was the governor who oversaw, I can't think of her name, Kathleen something, who was the Secretary of State who was counting the ballots. And somehow, so what happened in 2000 sort of was like what we hear from that call that a certain person put into Georgia, a few years ago to say, I need X number of votes.
Because the race was called, and then, Al Gore conceded, and it was like, wait a minute, nah, bro. You just got to go back and watch
if you were
exactly
young,
how it unfolded at the time. It's crazy.
If you were young, one good way to go back is to go to PBS's Frontline channel. Look up the Frontline for a lot of these events because they do a reasonably good job of summarizing stuff. But especially, I remember watching the Frontline, I think on that election, and where they were dimpled Chads and hanging Chads. Who even knew that the little punch out of paper from when you would do a paper ballot was called a Chad. The little piece hanging off. But anyway, it was just a whole big deal. But the bottom line is it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and ultimately Al Gore, like you said, conceded. And so people, when the inauguration happened on January 20th and folks saw the new president, man, folks were salty.
Yeah.
They were really salty about him being the president. And this is something that kind of immediately changed the sentiment, because you also had the Congress who was, folk had feelings, and they were in their feelings about this election, and it was still very raw. But then this happened, and literally that same night that this happened, or evening, you saw Congress standing on the steps singing God Bless America all together. And you kind of knew from that point that there was going to be a blank check written for whatever had to happen in order to make sure that this thing never happened again.
And just 3 days later, Bush is standing on rubble and giving a speech.
Yeah, talking about those who knocked those buildings, they're going to hear us all, pretty soon. And he didn't disappoint in that respect. Another thing is the amount of patriotism that people began to show after that. People who wouldn't be running around, but like with flags hanging from everywhere. That folk went and bought flags and had flags hanging from their car. Flags, U.S. flags, every single where. So that was another thing in terms of the show of patriotism. And people really felt like, banded together, which is one of the reasons that people give who are into the theories about that day as to a reason why this event may have happened too, or that folk may have known, et cetera, is because it really brought the country together after that. Money for whatever people needed, they worked together, so on and so forth, at least for a bit of time after that. The next thing is how I was really reminded this go round, how they try to blame the poorly trained and low wage private security screeners who used to, screen at the airport. Let me just jump in here and let you guys know that if you are not a member on Axiom.app, Patreon, or on YouTube, you are missing out on over 100 exclusive members-only videos, plus other perks like early access to some videos, your name listed as a contributor in videos, and more. So join today for as little as $5 a month, and it's a great way to support the channel. The links are in the description. Now, in my entire lifetime, as far as I remember, every time I've ever flown, even from a young age, you always had to put your stuff through the, X-ray machine and walk through some type of screening. All right. Back in the day, it wasn't the TSA. The workers who did that screening were not federal workers. They were these private, small security companies who, had contracts with the individual airlines and airports in order to be able to provide the screening. And the beef was that they felt that this should have been something that was in the hands of the government all along. But, of course, the government didn't want to take on another bill either. But after this is what had them to form the Transportation Security Administration and take on the role of making sure that they did the screening at these airports and other places. Now, the reason that I feel like blaming the workers wasn't fair is because them getting on those planes, they had box cutters, which if you had a blade that was less than 4 inches, that was allowed at that time. So tell me they didn't break the rules.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't have been prevented given the rules at that time. Now, maybe you're saying that, if they were better trained, then they would have come to the conclusion, or people would have come to the conclusion that the rules should have been different. Okay. But to blame the actual people who didn't fail, the people who were the screeners, I felt like was kind of foul. But it did open up a lot of jobs. And I have to say, for, working class and Black folk, to be able to get jobs, because when they started hiring for the TSA, a lot of people started working at the airport. A lot of people got jobs. In Chicago, you got these huge airports. Lots of folks got hired on with the government and got a nice government job. So that was a perk that some folks saw after that. And then of course after that date, you get the Patriot Act and all that. But I want to talk specifically about some of the coverage of what you saw. So day one, you really saw people saying, what is this? Like trying to make sense of it. Was that a plane? Was that not a plane? What happened here? Because not only did what happened in New York happen with both of the buildings, then you also had another plane that was at the Pentagon, and then you have the plane that went down in Shanksville. That was United Flight 93. So that was 4 planes, and a lot of scared people because it was, you got like things happening at 3 different locations and stuff, and so. They're covering that, but day one, the actual day of the event up until even after midnight, they were just trying to figure out. And then after the buildings were down, they were trying to figure out, hey, how are we going to start our rescue? But can we even get in there? Are things stable? And it took them until after midnight before they began to be able to go down into that rubble. And then the other thing is when I would watch on the 12th, is when people started to show up looking for people who they hadn't heard from, who worked in the area, who worked in the buildings. And to me, the 12th is always one of the hardest, 12th and 13th, the hardest days to watch, because that's when you hear all of these phone calls and interviews on the man on the street interviews with people who are down in the area. And by the 13th, most of the people who were looking for people had printed out like flyers of their person or people who they were looking for. Yeah. And it just was heartbreaking.
Very different from today when everyone has cell phones. So even like after the aftermath, you could have at least phone calls. Oh, I'm on the 56th floor or something. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. But this, you just don't hear of anything. All you hear of was what happened.
Right.
And then if somebody didn't have a cell phone or couldn't use someone else's cell phone or phone, then it's just silence.
Yeah. And so you have and the other thing too that was reported was how everybody was ready. They had their Office of Emergency Management that was there in New York that was new and fresh, and they had a headquarters that was down in that general area, and they were ready. The hospitals were ready. They were ready to receive people, and there just weren't people. There were the initial people who had burns, but not nearly that many people that they would have hoped that were rescued out of that rubble. And so that just was the sad thing. And let me tell you, one year when I was watching, it occurred to me when I'm watching, because, you always want to know, like at the time, you don't know, but I'm watching in the future from that time, in retrospect, looking back at these people on the news, and they're saying my person's name is so-and-so if you see them, and in that moment, I'm like, gee, I wonder if they made it or not. And finally, one year I got the idea that I would just look up and I would just look up their name. I pulled up the list and I would look up their name, and like 90% of the people who were standing there, it was just heartbreaking. And heartbreaking in the way that I feel like only a few years before with Oklahoma City, it was heartbreaking in the same way. I remember watching the coverage live, wall to wall, of Oklahoma City when it happened. And all of those babies at the daycare, I literally was just bawling in front of the TV. It was heartbreaking in that same way, but just on such a massive scale. And then the scary thing was that the initial numbers of people that they thought, they were like, oh, it could be 10,000. It could be 20,000. They kept saying on the coverage, hey, 50,000 people work in these towers. So depending on how many people might have been in there at any given time, tens of thousands of people it could be, or thousands and thousands. So the fact that it turned out to be just under 3,000 people. In the end, once everything shook out, it seemed like a lot less than was anticipated those first days of the coverage. Go to the comments. Do you guys ever go back? Have you ever watched the coverage? Do you watch the coverage of other events? And let me say, because I do, I go back and watch everything that is available. This year, actually, I did watch the full Watergate, the whole thing with Watergate, and when Nixon resigned, I watched that as it happened. And the nice thing about it is it's more than just when you have a documentary, right? The documentary has curated the parts they think are the most important, and you don't always get the fine details.
And as Black people, they always leave out the Black side of these stories, right? So when you're watching, you can see what the Black people of the time were saying, right? Or even just the caveats that are mentioned about, Black people, race, or any other group that you may be a part of or care about.
Yeah.
And you could hear how they're treating women and how the type of questions they ask women and all kinds of things.
And, the thing is, these events are like, Watergate, and more importantly, like the JFK, what happened with him.
And RFK. I went back but I had seen those multiple times because every so often I'll just go back and watch the coverage and see what, see how that was. It was almost wall to wall, but it's many hours of coverage on the day of and the days following to give you a really good idea. And that's important too, because I wasn't alive when that happened. Yeah. For like RFK, you wouldn't know it, but from the way people were talking, it was like it was MLK, Malcolm X, and RFK and JFK in the minds of Black people, right? Like those were the top 4 fighters of the time.
And you don't realize also that, like, for RFK, the death wasn't immediate. It was versus JFK. They went to the hospital, but yeah. And it was a point later, and even Tupac, right? Because we have the Tupac trial going on right now. Even with what happened with Tupac lived 6 days after. Yeah. He was shot. So.
Which is a whole nother conspiracy theory thing. So back in the day, in the 90s, there were websites dedicated to that conspiracy.
Yeah. Well, basically the idea that Tupac is like Black people's Elvis.
Yeah. And the numerology and all that stuff. It was very fascinating.
Well, but especially the whole thing about
Machiavelli.
Yeah. That really was, yeah. So I say all of this to say that there's a different way I think that you have to look at events that happened before you were alive or before you were old enough to really understand what was happening versus the ones that you lived through. The ones that you lived through, you can kind of know what happened and refresh your mind, so to speak. But when you were not alive and you're only going, the best thing to do is to go to the archival news footage as much as you can, even newspapers, and understand that is the history that was, newspapers is the history that was written in, and, things are often cut out. But what you see on the news at any given time, that is the broadcast television news, you're getting raw stuff there that just doesn't seem to make it down through the annals of history.
And then, so this event was so huge, and it brought us right to where we are in this world, right? So Hillary Clinton ran for Senate in New York in 2000.
Right.
And then this happens. You had Giuliani, who was the mayor at the time, who could not run again because of term limits, right? But you had Bloomberg, who was changed over to Republican at the time, I believe is what happened.
Yeah.
Where he was elected, right? And then you get in October, like 2 months, right? After, the next month, right? The Patriot Act. And in 2002, you get the Homeland Security Act.
Yeah, and that just changed everything. We've touched on, how life changed in a number of different ways. Certainly, the surveillance state was unfurled upon folk, and people were agreeable because nobody wanted to go through that again. Right. And I actually turned out that I went on a cruise in October of 2001, and I was scared to death. Because I was like, oh my gosh, do I want to do this a month? I'm not flying nowhere anytime, but I did wind up flying and going to the cruise, and it was okay. But
let me tell you about the TSA,
cautious.
y'all. So I ended up in the military, I was going I don't even remember where I was going or whatever. I was in my Alphas. That is the green dress uniform. I was in the Marine Corps. In the green dress uniform. I'm flying, right? I go, I'm going through the check and they like go over to the side and have me on the side in my uniform, taking off my shoes and searching me. That's what was happening after 9/11.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was kind of crazy. And, I at the time, I didn't have locks, so my hair wasn't a problem. But taking off of shoes, and I remember one time I was going through and they wanted me to take my sweater off because I had a shell tank underneath. And then I had a sweater and I was traveling for work. And they were like, "Oh, can you take your sweater off?" And I'm like, and absolutely not, because, I need to go in a room because, again, modesty and, whatnot, we don't do that. And so they acted like I was nuts for not wanting to disrobe in front of the people at the station, the screening station. It just, and then I just got to the point, at this point, I was working for, working a corporate job that required a lot of travel, and I just had to suck it up and do it then. But even now, it can be rigorous. And because, you guys know, I have locks and I have a lot of hair. Every time we have flown, I have to get this secondary, put your hands in my hair because maybe I'm hiding something in there or whatever. But the body scanners it doesn't like my hair. It's a problem. And the longer it gets, the more of a problem it is. And I hate the screening process, honestly. I recognize that it's for safety, but I have avoided flying if at all possible just because I just hate
I guess it's for safety.
The back
That's
and forth.
Just the biggest argument of all of this, right? Is, your security versus safety, blah, blah, blah.
Well, because I can remember when it wasn't like this. I can remember when it was an experience to go to the airport and wait for someone to fly in, and you parked your car and you went there and you waited.
But it's not really just about the experience.
It's
about what's reasonable for everybody, right? So...
I mean, after the days after this event, believe me, they were having because you were limited on the liquids you could take too. They were having mothers chugging their breast milk to make sure that it wasn't something in there that was a contraband or toxic, whatever. I mean, it was wild. It was a wild time in those, especially. I think that they've relaxed a little bit. But yeah, it was a wild time. For those of you who have ever watched one of our deep dives and thought you should cover this movie next, Deep Dive on Demand is for you. With a sole executive producer credit, you can choose any movie you want for just a $75 contribution. You'll be the sole executive producer on that video. You're going to receive on-screen credit and get a shout out during the video. Looking for a lower cost option? Our co-executive producer credits start at just $10. Simply choose a film from our select list and you'll receive on-screen credit and a shout out alongside the other co-executive producers for that video. We also have a couple of limited time bundles available to you. You can get 3 co-executive producer credits for just $25, which is a $30 value. Or our biggest bundle yet, 1 sole executive producer credit for the movie of your choice, plus 3 co-executive producer credits for just $75. And that's a $105 value. This is a great way to support the channel while helping us to decide what movies we're going to cover next. So you'll find links to all of these options in the description. Thanks, and let's get back to the video. Another thing that came up when I was looking at this was that October 7th was the day that George W. Bush had the folk go into Afghanistan. And then because I was like, October 7th.
2001?
2001.
How did they do that so fast?
Because they knew where they wanted to go and mounted up and, So then in addition to that, I thought about, okay, and then of course we know that recently there's another October 7th, and that was in 2023, that happened with, and I was like, I wonder if there was any significant, and I tried to quickly research that. I didn't have a whole lot of time to do it, but go to the comments. Did you guys know about the connection of those dates, and what happened with Israel on October 7th of 2023, and that October 7th was the date that they went into Afghanistan in 2001. So anyway, just a little tidbit of trivia for you.
Yeah. 100,000 people possibly dead, maybe, or 200,000.
Yeah, just wild.
And they lost.
Just wild, you know. And then over there for like 20 some
20
years.
Yeah.
That's another thing. We didn't know at the time that it would be that, you know. So just a whole bunch of stuff for real. But the coverage, again, it gives you a better impression than a documentary. You watch a 2-hour documentary, you kind of get the feel. And the coverage doesn't have to be something that you're intently watching. Like a lot of times what I'll do, I'm doing something else. I'm looking at my phone or whatever, and it's kind of playing in the background, but I'm hearing what's happening at the time that it's happening, you know. But there was something else that I read. So I came across on Reddit this comment that asked a question, right? And the question was, did 2001 and 2002 truly feel like different worlds after 9/11 happened? And so they go on to ask this question in this way. For those of you who were old enough to have lived through 9/11 or could remember it to some degree, do you think that these 2 years feel completely different from each other despite being only 1 year apart from one another? Obviously, I wasn't alive or even conceived when 9/11 happened, so I can't speak on this from any kind of personal experiences. But based on everything I've heard about 9/11, that basically 9/11 just, killed the 90s, whether that would be the optimism about the future or pop culture influences transitioning to a more gritty and patriotic lifestyle. Americans had to get used to it. And it seems that signs do in fact point to the fact that we were in an entirely different time period after, September 11. And so the closest experience that I've had to something as changeful as 9/11 would be, the pandemic, where everybody was isolated and on lockdown. And I'm paraphrasing this last part that the poster said, but where everybody was isolated and on lockdowns, which heavily affected society for a while. And there was a massive shift to where it looked like 2019 was like a different world compared to 2020. And does the same logic apply to 2001 and 2002 for those who are old enough to remember it? So I thought this was a good question and these are the kinds of questions you should ask if you weren't here.
So the whole thing with the pandemic is that the aftermath isn't as changed, right? We had this moment where this thing happened, but now it's just like back to 2019 again, right? Nobody's more concerned about these illnesses in mass, right?
Right.
So that's the kind of a difference. But when it happened, that was a big significant event that lasted much longer than the events around the days of 9/11.
Yeah. What I'll say is I think people were not as scared in mass during the pandemic as they were. Because see, during the pandemic, the people who were young and healthy were just like, whatever.
Yeah.
If I bring it to grandma just hopefully she be good, But if you, are middle-aged or older, or if anybody has certain health concerns or whatever, then many of them, not all, were more concerned about the potential effects of this on them. And so I think it was kind of split along those lines. But or if you're young, like that might be the closest thing that you could sort of, it's kind of like that, but a little different the way Heit explained,
And not discounting the lives lost, but this Iran war thing now is nothing compared to that, what happened, right? And of course, that was nothing compared to Vietnam, but you have to consider probably where you are and where our whole lives, nothing happened militarily with the country.
Right.
So
whereas if you were born since, you might have been born during, the war, born with them reporting on Afghanistan,
but the reporting was different, right? Because so nothing had happened. Then this thing happened. There's 2 wars, and then they're showing the body counts, like 14 people died, and these are the people and all the lists and where they're from, and keeping count every day on the news. The total was up to 1,200. You know what I'm saying? And then people where you're from are dying, and they're putting that on the local news. You know what I'm saying? Like that was just a crazy, crazy time where really that wasn't our lives before. And you had like MC Hammer coming back making songs.
Well, and it was like loss of innocence, so to speak. The way they will describe it's the loss of innocence. But it really feels like that because even though technically we were grown, the life we had lived up to that point in terms of this type of fear and this type of concern for yourself, everything bad happened other places. It didn't happen here. And you can judge that however you want to judge it, but that's just was the reality at the time. It wasn't something that happened here. It was over there. I mean, we lived through plenty of historic events, but it wasn't here.
Even inside this country, right? All the stuff that's in the 90s of, the Rodney Kings and all of that, and, they shooting black people and killing us and getting off and stuff, right? That was just limited to the black community, right? So then when this happened, it was like, wait, we're in trouble too. You know what I'm saying? Then they have a concern that, what we kind of talk about now, where we always have this unease when we're going out into the world because something might happen to us for being black. They were like, we go out into the world and something happened because we're American.
Mm-hmm. Considering, does it feel like 25 years to you? I don't know what 25 years feels like.
I think it do, I guess.
It feels like a long time. Like, I've certainly led a lifetime since then, but
because of everything that happened, it feels like, yes, like all this stuff compounded. It feels like it was an eternity ago in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think that it is quite possibly one of the considering how many were lost in one single day, like 3,000 people in one day based on, a multi-front, event is a lot of people. And if you were from New York, and share in the comments, if you were from New York or those areas, or knew people who worked in the Pentagon and stuff like that. One of the things that I knew at the time is, my sister worked for a major a huge company in the Chicago office, but they had offices in the World Trade Center. And interestingly, the year before that, she had been receiving training in the towers on that exact day. And I often think about that, like that's just a crazy, connection. Or you hear about the people who were supposed to be someplace and were late, or somebody was talking about their daughter wanted something, some treat, but a donut, something like that. And they were supposed to be in there and they weren't in there. And then you look at all of the people, some made it down 100, flights. But the other thing that wasn't discussed early, but came out later on the news too, is that there were people who had gotten down that were in the
Lobby?
South Tower. That was the second one to be hit. See, people started evacuating the one that wasn't hit before it got hit. And they get to the bottom and people are like, well, it's all right, go on back up. And there are people who went back up that never came out of there. And, I just say, follow your first mind. And at the end of the day, don't go back up. If you have any inkling, any question, just get out of the area.
Just think of this. Think of the people who you work with and the decisions they make daily when things aren't serious. And consider that when they're making possibly life-altering, life-changing decisions for you.
Yeah, just go ahead and write me up because I'm not going back upstairs. Not happening. And then I was thinking about it. I was like, okay, but what about like, do you, if you're on another floor and your purse is upstairs, just minor things that could have delayed you. You're like, well, let me get my purse and then I'm going to go. Let me do such and such, because there are some people who made it out just by, in the nick of time, made it out. And as soon as they got out, that's when things came down. So
I don't like to think about it, but the decision to get burnt up or jump too is just like,
oh yeah, that was horrific. And actually, if you watch what was I watching? We were watching. Is that a documentary? It was new. You know what? It's a new documentary. It wasn't part of this footage. It was a documentary.
Oh, with the cop or the DEA?
Right, where they were recording because they got the first plane, and it was with the fire department, the New York Fire Department. And this was their, I guess, internal footage or whatever, because they were showing training and showing, something. They were out doing a gas leak or something when everything went down. And you could hear, because they were staging in the lobby of one of the towers, and you could hear bam, bam, and it was like shaking the roof of this lobby area, which kind of stuck out a little from the building, and that was the people. And it was horrible. They also had another terrible story on there about a man who had helped a woman out who had been, badly burned in the lobby or some area, and he helped her out, only to later realize that while he was saying the Lord's Prayer with her, the plane that his nephew and his sister were on rammed into the second tower to get hit. It's just the stuff that you hear, that definitely affected and changed everybody who lived through it. And it's kind of one of those events, like, I would ask my mom, hey, where were you, when JFK, because she was a kid at the time this happened. And she told me what she remembered. I remember asking my grandmother, back when she was alive, what, to try to get an idea of what it was like to have lived through these, events that happened during their lifetime. And I think it's good. The oral history and tradition is good to be able to pass on to the young people also. And I guess that's part of what we're doing here, sharing it to you, even though, you're not our biological family members. You are our, cousins. And these are important conversations and important bits of history that should be cataloged and not lost with the retelling and erasure of things as they inevitably happen. So that's it. But you can, and all of these things that I've been watching lately are on YouTube. So you can usually Google the date and it'll come up with the different archives. The best ones have the time stamps in them so that you can know what times during that date that you're watching. And it'll also have the station, ABC, NBC, CNN, or whatever.
If you made it this far, type "watch this drive" in the comments so we'll know you're one of the real ones who stick around to the end.
And be sure to check out one of the videos that's on the screen right now. And also be sure to visit axiom.app, where you'll find all of our recent videos in one place with links to them back on YouTube so that you can watch them here.